Tonight's class is on the Torah portion of Emor. Emor is a interesting Torah portion because it discusses the bulk of the Jewish holidays, all the Jewish holidays, but it also discusses Shabbos. And there are many laws that are analyzed as a result of being Shabbos being in between, sandwiched between the holidays. Being that one may think that it's not a holiday, it's a Shabbos. Shabbos is something that happens every single week. It's different than a holiday, the holiday that happens only once in a while. Nonetheless, we have Shabbos and various laws associated with the Shabbos in this week's Torah portion. And so that's what we are going to focus on tonight, the laws of Shabbos. But before we do that, we will go through an overview of this week's Torah portion. And so here we have it. So the Torah portion begins, the Torah section of Emor, speak, begins with the special laws pertaining to the Kohanim, the priests, and the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, and the temple service. A Kohen may not become ritually impure through contact with a dead body. In other words, he does become ritually impure. He's not allowed to do it voluntarily, save on the occasion of the death of a close relative. Close relative is not for us to decide. It's close relative what Torah decides, and that is a parent, a sibling, a child, God forbid, and a spouse. A Kohen may, and in those cases, a Kohen is permitted to become impure, is permitted to go close to the deceased and partake in the funeral. A Kohen may not marry a divorcee or a woman with a promiscuous past. A Kohen Gadol, the high priest, can marry only a virgin. A Kohen with a physical deformity cannot serve in the holy temple, nor can a deformed animal be brought as an offering. The Torah portion then continues. A newborn calf, lamb, or kid must be left with its mother for 7 days before being eligible to be an offering. One may not slaughter an animal and its offspring on the same day. In other words, even if it's not as a sacrifice and one needs an animal meat for a holiday, for the holiday of Passover, and the animals are elderly. They're 5, 6 years old already. Nonetheless, those animals are not allowed to be slaughtered on the same day. The second part of Emor, of this week's Torah portion, lists the annual callings of holiness, the festivals of the Jewish calendar, the weekly Shabbat, the bringing of the Passover offering on the 14th of Nisan, the 7-day Passover festival beginning the 15th of Nisan, and the bringing of the Emor offering from the first barley harvest on the 2nd day of Passover, and the commencement on that day of the 49-day counting of the Emor, culminating in the festival of Shavuot on the 50th day, which will be in a few weeks. A remembrance of shofar blowing on the 1st of Tishrei, a solemn fast day on the 10th of Tishrei. That's obviously a reference to Yom Kippur. The Sukkot festival, during which we are to dwell in huts for 7 days and take the 4 kinds, the 4 species, the lulav and etrog, beginning on the 15th of Tishrei and in the immediately following holiday of the 8th day of Sukkot. And finally, the Torah portion discusses the lighting of the menorah in the temple, and the showbread, the lechem hapanim, placed weekly on the table there in the temple. Emor concludes with the incident of a man executed for blasphemy and the penalties for murder, death, and for injuring one's fellow or destroying his property, monetary compensation. As is with every single weekly Torah portion, there is so much to discuss on all these details. I'm sure many of us have ideas and thoughts and questions, comments, and maybe criticism, critique on this week's Torah portion, but we are only going to zero in on that single line here, the weekly Shabbat, a unique perspective on Shabbos. And that is, what is Shabbos? What is it? We know that Shabbos is a day of rest, right? If you ask anyone who went through Hebrew school, and even if we didn't go through Hebrew school, we know that Shabbos is a day of rest. It's a day off from work. It's a day to spend with family and friends and community. We go to synagogue, and we get to sleep in. It's a day off. But why pick Shabbos, not Tuesday, not Sunday? Why does the Torah pick Shabbos? And so we all know because God worked on 6 days to create the world, and he rested on the seventh day. And so God rested on the seventh, we rest on the seventh. But in reality, if we think about it, there are so many things that we repeat because that's what we were raised with, that's what we know. But if we think deeply into it, it doesn't really add up logically. And this is one of them, really. God rested on the seventh day, so we rest. What exactly does that mean? And what I mean by that is when we analyze Shabbos from a Jewish perspective, Shabbos is not a day of relaxation per se. It's a day of lavish meals, it's lots of preparation that have to go into that, serving, cleaning, setting up. There's going to the synagogue, spending a few hours in the synagogue, praying, studying Torah. So yes, it's family time, it's different type of work, but it's still work. It's not a relaxation, it's not a vacation day. It's not a day where we sit on the beach for 12 hours, just relaxing and basking in the sun. So it's not resting in the literal sense of it. It's resting, it's different type of work, but it's still work, albeit more spiritual. But a more fundamental question is, what do we mean when we say God rested on the seventh day? Does God really need rest? Really? God worked for 6 days? The Torah tells us, and Kabbalah expounds upon it, that when we say God worked for 6 days, God didn't really work. All God had to do was speak. Let there be light, and there was light. Let there be grass, and there was grass, vegetation. Whatever it was, God just spoke. There wasn't really work. So what type of hard, grueling work did God have to rest from? And when we say God rested, does that mean he literally put his feet up, he went to sleep? He had a nice lazy boy recliner. He had a lawn chair. What exactly did he do to rest? Doesn't mean that God rested. Following that train of thought, what does that mean for us? Obviously, our rest and the divine rest are very, very different ideas. So why do we say that we rest on Shabbos when we're trying to emulate God's rest, whatever that was? Another aspect or issue we have with the general understanding of Shabbos is we say that Shabbos is a day of rest, but we also call it Shabbos Kodesh. Shabbos Kodesh. For those of you who are familiar with a classic Hebrew school song, Shabbos, Shabbos, we sing Shabbos, Shabbos, Yom Menucha, Shabbos, Shabbos Kodesh. You may have heard a song in some sort of variation that those words, Shabbat Kodesh. It's a common phrase, which means that Shabbos is holy. Is a holy day a rest day? When we go on vacation for an extended Mother's Day weekend coming up, right? Is that a holy day or is that a rest day? It's a vacation day. And then there are days that are holy. They aren't necessarily one and the same. They're not synonymous. So why do we say that Shabbos is a rest day and it's a holy day? What does it mean that it's a holy day? What makes it holy? Why is it holy? Because God rested, it becomes holy. And so we may say that the reason why we're saying that Shabbos is holy is because mundane work is forbidden. And that's why Shabbos is holy. But the verse that tells us about Shabbos, one of the first verses in the Torah, tells us that it works exactly the opposite. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it holy because God rested, or did God rest because it's holy? Do we not do mundane work on Shabbos because it's a holy day, or is it a holy day because we don't do mundane work? Here's the verse from the Torah. The beginning of the Torah, we say it every Friday night in the Kiddush. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. Why? Why did God sanctify it? For on it he rested from all his work. Because God rested, that's why it's a holy day. So the rest brings the holiness. Do we say it's a holy day because we went on vacation? What's going on over here? It seems that there's something holy about God's rest, and that's why Shabbos becomes holy. Why? What is that? So Rashi, our favorite commentary on the first few verses of chapter 2 in Genesis, explains something interesting. It says that God's relaxation on the seventh day of creation wasn't merely relaxation. It was something more profound. Text 2, and for those who have the book, it's on page 58. What was the world lacking? Rest. Along came Shabbat, along came rest. With this, the work of creation was completed. What does this tell us? Something somewhat counterintuitive. You see, one would have thought that came Friday afternoon, God's working really fast to complete the 6 days of creation. And just before the buzzer, just before sundown on Friday afternoon, God finished that final action of creation. Creation is now complete. Figuratively, God can kick off his shoes and put his feet up. The world is complete. Says Rashi, no, the world was not complete. Came Friday afternoon, and with the action, the world was missing something. With the lack of action on Shabbos, with the lack of work, whatever the divine work is, we'll get to that in a moment. But it was precisely with the lack of work that now creation was complete. So it's not that he worked and so creation was complete, it's he rested and so creation was complete. God had to stop acting. God had to reverse course from the prior 6 days. And only then, by not creating, creation became complete. Which kind of leads us deeper into the initial questions that we had, which is, what exactly is Shabbos all about? What is in that rest of the divine that made the world complete? What is in the rest of the divine that we try to emulate it by being holy on Shabbos and by celebrating a holy day on Shabbos? How is our going to synagogue emulating God's rest on Shabbos? To understand that, we're going to delve a little deeper into a Kabbalistic explanation of what happens on Shabbos. So the next time someone asks you if you've ever studied Kabbalah, you can say you did. If you joined these classes, even one other class, I'm sure you've studied Kabbalah already. But this, we're going to learn a new Kabbalistic term. And that term is Tzimtzum. Sounds like a tongue twister. It is somewhat, but that's the word, Tzimtzum. What does Tzimtzum mean? In Hebrew, Tzimtzum is, you spell it Tzadik, Yud, Mem, Tzadik, Vav, Mem. In English, Tzim, Tzum. Tzimtzum. What does Tzimtzum mean? As follows. We all know that God is infinite. And by being infinite, we mean that God is everything and everywhere, all the time. Before the world was created, there was only God. That's all there was. Before the world was created, God was everything and everywhere. But now the question is, if God is everything and everywhere, how could God create the world, which is something new? And there are two problems with that. The first one is, if everything is God, because God is everything, because God is infinite and omnipotent and is all over the place, and everything in this world or outside of the world, the universe, beyond our wildest imagination, was all the divine before the creation, then how could there exist something which isn't God, something which God creates that's outside of himself? Now, even if you can figure out how to make something which is outside of God, where do you put it? Everything is God. God is everywhere. Where do you put this thing? In our case, the world, the universe, where do you put it if everything is the divine? So God came up with a phenomenal idea, and the Kabbalists put the word to it, tzimtzum. That's where tzimtzum comes in. What does tzimtzum mean? Tzimtzum literally means concealment. In short, God concealed himself and made space for us, for you, for me, for the world, for the table we're using, the computer. God concealed himself and made room. But concealed himself is the key. God didn't remove himself. God concealed himself. Because in truth, God fills this space that we are in now. And in truth, there is nothing but God. And if we were able to see the truth, all we would see is the divine. We'd see the divine in ourselves, in others, in the computers we're using, in the books we read, in the car we drive, in the sun, in the stars, and the road. Wherever we look, all we would see is the divine. Because in truth, that's what it is. But if we had such an awareness, we would cease to exist. Because we wouldn't be ourselves, because we wouldn't be able to perceive ourselves, we wouldn't be able to see ourselves as independent beings. All we would see is an extension of the divine reality. And so in order to enable us to function as if we are independent beings, God concealed this truth from us. Even if we may understand it, so long as we can't see it, we're able to function and operate as if it isn't so. Here's an analogy that the Kabbalists use to a certain degree. We walk outside, it's 9 a.m., it's a beautiful day, 6 a.m., 7 a.m., whatever time we walk outside in the morning, in the afternoon, it's daylight. Daylight enables us to see. We wake up in the morning, we pull up the shades in our home, daylight floods in, it's healthy, vitamin D, especially during the COVID, you need to get extra vitamin D, right? We love sunlight. Sunlight enables us to see it, gives us vitamin D, but you know what? What happens when it's really, really sunny? Or if we get too close to the sun? Or if we look directly at the sun, I want to be really, really able to see really well. Not only are we not able to see, we will be blinded by the sun's light. It's too bright for us to see. So it's kind of two opposites. On the one hand, we need the sun to see, but on the other hand, if the sun is too powerful, we can no longer see. Similar idea of what we're discussing here. On the one hand, without the divine, we wouldn't be in existence because we need God to create us and to constantly vivify us, animate us, create us. We need a revealed aspect of the divine. But on the other hand, if the divinity within us is too powerful, it's too revealed, we'd cease to exist because we'd only see the divine truth in everything. And so that's where Tzimtzum comes in. In order to create this perfect balance between revelation and concealment, there had to be a balance. Tzimtzum is that balance. Tzimtzum, concealment, is the divine energy necessary for us to be alive, to be breathing, to be here, talking, walking, thinking. But on the other hand, concealment, so we're able to perceive ourselves as independent beings. Here's a powerful text from the Tanya, the foundational work of Chabad Hasidus, where the Alter Rebbe, Mishneh Zalman of Liadi, discusses this exact concept. Text 3, page 59. God's power of restraint is the quality of tzimtzum, concealment, whereby he withholds his great expansiveness and prevents it from descending and being revealed to created beings. Rather than animating all of creation openly, he operates in concealment to create the impression that the created being exists independently from God. Though the created being, in truth that is, has no independent existence, nevertheless, the restraining power of the omnipotent God conceals the spiritual life force that flows from him so as not to nullify the existence of the created being. Because if the created being recognized and saw the truth, he'd only see the divine truth. And so what the concealment accomplishes, it doesn't remove the divine, God forbid. It enables a person to have the impression as if it's independent of the Almighty. So on the one hand, our existence depends on God. But on the other hand, this fact has to be concealed if we are to perceive ourselves as beings with an independent existence. Just like this, the analogy of the sun. On the one hand, we need the light of the sun so we can see. On the other hand, if it's too powerful, we won't be able to see. So it has to be concealed to a certain degree in order to ensure that there isn't an overabundance of life. And that's what tzimtzum is. Now, this balance between revelation and concealment has gradations. It's not equal by all creations. Not all creations have the same amount of divine revelation or divine concealment. Some creations have more revelation of the divine within them, some have less. How do we know? What are those gradations? Here's a text also from the Tanya, from the Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, that explains it perfectly. Text 4, page 60. The diffusion of God's light, which is the life force of creation, is not equal in all created beings in the balance of its concealment and revelation. What are those gradations? Here's the lowest of the rung, the lowest of the ladder, the lowest rung of the ladder. In physical and inanimate bodies, such as stones and soil, the light is most restricted. The life force is so minimal that it can't even grow. By contrast, the divine light in plant life is less restricted. And that's why it grows. There's movement. Generally speaking, there are 4 categories: the inanimate, the botanical, the animal, and the human. The diffusion of divine light and life force in the inanimate and plant life can't be compared to the light and life force in the animal or in the human. There's a divine life force in everything. There's a soul in everything. A pebble, a stone has a soul, has a divine life force in it. But you can't compare the divine life force that's in a stone to the divine life force that's in an apple tree. The divine life force in a stone is so low, it's so concealed, that the stone doesn't move. It can't grow. There's no signs of life in it. Whereas when we move up the category into vegetation, into the botanical, an apple tree has life. It sprouts from a little seed. There's movement. It grows an inch, 2 inches. I was watching in my backyard. We have a weeping willow tree, for those of you who have been here. And 4 weeks ago, there were almost no leaves on it. And it moved pretty quickly in the past 4 weeks. And it was fascinating to watch. Every morning I'd look at it to see the new leaves, the new branches that grew on it. Now it's full. There's a life force. There's a greater divine life force in a tree. Moving up a notch, the divine life force in an animal, granted, it's a lot greater than that in a vegetation, but you can't compare it to the divine life force in a person. In an animal, it's lateral. It can move. It can communicate to a certain degree, but it doesn't really have a brain, a thinking brain. It's unable to make calculations, to invent, to speak coherently. Right? There's no rabbi in the forest. No one drones on and on with speeches. They're alive. They don't have free choice. So humans have a much greater life force, divine life force, than animals do. And then we have angels. Angels are beyond this calculation because they don't have any physical form. They're incorporeal. They don't have any physical form. And so their life force is in an entire different plane than that of the 4 categories. And so as God descends through the life force chain, God conceals himself more and more. That's the long and short of creation from a Kabbalistic perspective. But now how about the reverse? Does God ever reverse the Tzimtzum? Is there ever a time when God says, you know what, now's the time to tear off that Tzimtzum, to remove that concealment, and to reveal the divine life force in a greater manner than it ever was? In other words, are there creations, are there times that God says, you know what, they should become more aware of the fact that they're alive and that their life force is divine? They should become more cognizant of that fact to recognize that reality. Is there a time or a creation that God says, you know what, let's remove the Tzimtzum, all or somewhat? The answer is yes. There is a time when God says, all right, it's time to roll back that curtain somewhat. It's time to show the true colors. It's time for these creations to feel a little bit more of the reality of the truth. It's time to have a little bit more of that creator creation reality in a more pronounced way. When does that happen? When does God remove that Tzimtzum? On Shabbos. To whom or for whom does God remove that Tzimtzum? For human beings. Now let's go back to the first 7 days of creation, the 6 days of creation and Shabbos. What was God doing the first 6 days of creation? Tzimtzum. Was all involved in the concealment of the divine in order to create these 4 levels, these 4 categories, the entire universe within which we are. Then came Shabbos, and Shabbos, God rolled back the Tzimtzum a little bit. Now it's time for the creations to recognize, not fully, but to a degree, their divine life force. Text 5, in the words of Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber Schneerson, the 5th Chabad Rebbe, page 61. The concept of divine rest is to refrain from tzimtzum. What did God do on Shabbos? When it says the 7th day God came and rested, it doesn't mean rest literally. It means God refrained from tzimtzum, from the concealment. As it is written in those first few verses that we quoted earlier, chapter 2 from the book of Genesis, in that passage that we read every single Friday night when we make the Kiddush, Yom HaShishi, one of the verses that we say is, Elokim completed on the 7th day. What's Elokim? Elokim is the name of God that represents God's capacity for restraint and concealment. And on Shabbat, the tzimtzum implied by the name Elokim expired, and God rested from the act of tzimtzum. Something similar occurs every week on Shabbos. On this day, God rests from the act of concealment, and the divine light is revealed without the veil of tzimtzum, making us aware that we are standing before the King. You see, in the Hebrew, for those of us who can read or even understand somewhat Hebrew, it says Vayichal. Vayichal. What does the word Vayichal mean? Vayichal, depending on context, generally means completed. So Vayichal Elokim Bayom HaShvi'i, and God completed on the 7th day. But Vayichal has another explanation, another translation. Vayichal, and it expired. It ended. Full stop. Vayichal Elokim, not that God completed creation. Vayichal Elokim, and God, the Elokim element of creation expired. Elokim is not a reference to God's essence. Elokim is a reference to the act of concealment within creation. That is what Elokim means. And so that act, Vayichal, it expired. God refrained from tzimtzum, from concealment. God revealed the divine life force in everything. The entire world was on a holier level now, because the entire world had the concealment removed. Something similar to that first time, that first Shabbos, it was removed on a much greater level. But every single week on Shabbos, the divine concealment is pulled back somewhat. And the entire world has a greater level of divine life force, recognition of the divine life force, which is in our essence. That's what happens every single Shabbos. So now we see, when we say that God rested, it doesn't mean that God was tired and he had to kick back. It doesn't mean he rested. It means he rested because he had to put something to rest. What did he rest? He rested tzimtzum. He rested tzimtzum because, yes, the world was created, but it didn't recognize its creator. The concealment was too effective. The world needed rest from concealment. And so how did God give it rest? How did God give the world rest? Because God rested the concealment for Shabbos. He withdrew it. And now the identity of its creator became clear. Now we can understand what we read in text 1. In text 1, we read the verse, and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, for on it he rested from all his work. God sanctified it because he rested. In other words, because he rested Tzimtzum, because he removed the act of the concealment, now it became sanctified because now it was recognizable. Its true life force, its divine life force, its holier level was now revealed, became clear. It revealed this day the great life force, and so it became a holy day. And this doesn't happen just on that first Shabbos. This happens every single Shabbos, every single week, year in, year out, week in, week out, month in, month out, every single week. For 6 days, God conceals himself entirely from creation and animates us without us appreciating it, without us recognizing it and realizing that God is the source of our vitality. And then what happens on Shabbos? God rests from the concealment and he allows himself to be more revealed. Now we can understand why the resting causes it to be a holy day. So you may ask, I go through every Shabbos. Is it discernible? Can I recognize on Shabbos that this is a holy day? Is there something that I can put my finger on it? The Talmud says, yes, very clearly so. On Shabbos, every single one of us is more in tune with our soul, more connected with the Almighty. We are more spiritual on Shabbos. The 24 hours, 24 plus hours of Shabbos, we are more connected to God. We're more in tune with our spiritual self. As the Talmud says, an additional text 6, page 62, an additional measure of soul is given to us on Friday afternoon and is taken from us on Saturday night. This is derived from the verse, on the seventh day, Shabbat vayinafash. He rested and was refreshed. These Hebrew words form an abbreviation for Kivan Sheshavat Vay Avda Nefesh. Translated, once Shabbat ends, whoa, our additional soul is lost. We each have an extra soul on Shabbos, an additional measure of soul on Shabbos. We are inherently holier, more in tune with our divine side, with our soul, with our spirituality on Shabbos. So much so that when our additional measure of soul leaves us on Saturday night, there's a certain measure of melancholy that sets in. And what do we do about that? We're all familiar with the Havdalah ceremony. We do it in our home. We've done it in the synagogue. We may have seen the rabbi do it in camp, wherever it may be. We've heard about the Havdalah ceremony. What do we do at the Havdalah ceremony? We hold a cup of wine, similar to Kiddush. We fill it up with wine, but then we do two other rituals. We have the candle, Borei Morei Ha'esh, and then we have spices. We smell spices, Samim. Bisamim. We make a special blessing and we smell cinnamon, cloves, herbs, whatever spices one wants, herbs. Why do we do that smelling? Why do we smell those spices? So the Talmud says as follows, and the Alter Rebbe in the Code of Jewish Law explains. Precisely for this reason is why we smell those spices. Text 7. Our sages instituted the ritual of smelling spices at the end of Shabbos to revive the soul, which is melancholy at this time over the departure of the additional soul. We settle the soul and cheer it with a pleasing fragrance. The fact that we're so melancholy at the departure of our additional soul tells us how clearly we're affected by this additional measure of holiness that we receive from the rollback of the Tzimtzum on Shabbos. Jews the world over recognize the holiness and a sense of peace, serenity, holiness ushers in when we light the candles on Friday. Now, this feeling, to be sure, is not just for Jews who recognize it. It's not just for people who recognize, who light the Shabbos candles. How about those of us, maybe some Shabbos, in the past, we didn't even know it was Shabbos. There are people who still don't know it's Shabbos. Even for them, they can feel it. And they do feel it. They may not recognize why they feel it. As the Medrash explains, text 8, a person's face is incomparably more radiant on Shabbos than the rest of the week. And Jewish history has many, many stories of people who literally looked different on Shabbos. Sages who related that stories about great sages throughout the ages who, when they were children, they would recognize the greatness of Shabbos based on looking at people and seeing their faces change. So it's not just in rituals that we have the besamim, that we have this extra soul, and so we have the besamim, but it's actually recognizable on people. And here's an interesting narrative from Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, the founder of Yeshiva University, who relates an interesting episode from his time in Warsaw, back before the war. Text 9. In Warsaw, we lived 3 houses away from the Mojicer Shtibel. It's a Hasidic sect, Mojits. So they lived 3 houses away from the Mojicer Shtibel. Generally, I would go to the Mojicer Shtibel for the Seudah Shlishit, the 3rd meal of the Shabbos afternoon meal. They would sing all the Zemirot, the songs for the Seudah Shlishit. Poor Jews would be seated around the table in the Shtibel. I knew these Jews well, and I constantly spoke with them. They were sincerely pious Jews who willingly sacrificed for their spiritual commitments. I once spoke with one of them who was frail and short. He constantly carried heavy metal pieces, and I wondered where he got the physical strength to support this weight. His load was always tied around him with a thick cord, and he totally resembled a coolie. I had no idea what a coolie is. I had to check it out. A coolie, apparently in the 19th and early 20th century, a coolie was a term that was used for to identify an indentured servant. And so this individual, he looked the part of an indentured servant. Continues Rabbi Soloveitchik, on the Shabbos, I saw this very Jew and I did not recognize him. He came over to me in his tattered kapata, his long Shabbos coat. It was covered with endless patches, and even the patches had patches. Yet his face shone with the joy of the Shabbos. I recognized in a tangible fashion that a person's Shabbos countenance is totally different than his weekday appearance. And if it's like that, if this is true for a simple, pious Jew, imagine how truer it is for great sages who actually recognize the holiness of the Shabbos. They say of the great Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin, known as the Ruzhiner, who was the patriarch of a very large Hasidic family and Hasidic courts. Many of the Hasidic courts today are descendants of the great Rabbi Yisrael Ruzhin, who passed away in 1850. The story is told that when he was a child, his teacher was talking about the greatness of Shabbos and the laws of Shabbos. And one of the laws of Shabbos is what happens if someone loses count and doesn't know when Shabbos is. Nowadays, we all have calendars on our phones, it's on our watches, it's very easy. But back in the day, it happened. People got lost while traveling, people lost count of days if they weren't in a new community. What happens if someone loses count? And Maimonides has various laws. The Code of Jewish Law discusses it. What happens if someone loses count? And the child's little Yisrael was confused. What do you mean someone loses count? How do you lose count? And so the teacher started explaining. Someone wandered alone off into the desert, got lost. He still couldn't understand. So the teacher asked him, what's bothering him? He says, what do you mean what's bothering me? On Friday evening, I walk outside. I look up in the sky and I see this special Shabbos cloud, special Shabbos sky. It looks different. It is different. Even at a young age, you realized and recognized the greatness of this day and the fact that all of creation reflected this idea of the rollback of its concealment of the divine. This concept also affects Jewish law. The law is that when a bride and groom get married, for 7 days of something called Sheva Brachot. 7 days of celebration for the bride and groom. And every day there's a festive meal and where we say 7 blessings special for the bride and groom. But there's one caveat, says the Talmud. We chant the blessings of the bridegroom in the presence of 10 men for 7 days. Rabbi Yehuda says only if a new face arrives. We're not going to get into the details on why a new face has to be there, but there has to be someone who wasn't at the initial wedding celebration who's joining each subsequent celebration of the following 7 days. And each day of the 7 days, there has to be someone new who wasn't at any of the prior celebrations. So every day you need someone new, except for, continues the Talmud, Shabbos, because Shabbos is also considered a new face. What does that mean? Shabbos is considered a new face. We say that when it comes the day of Shabbos, in the week following the wedding, the wedding was Thursday night, so Friday night, you can say the 7 blessings for the bride and groom without having anyone new, because Shabbos is like a new person who's joining the table. They never celebrated their wedding celebration on a Shabbos. That's a traditional understanding. But you know what? They never celebrated the wedding celebration on a Tuesday either. So why on a Tuesday do you need a new face? But now that we have this understanding that we're not just saying Shabbos is a new face. What we're saying is that every person who's there at the celebration is a new person because they now have a recognition of their divine life force on a much greater level, and they have a greater divine revelation. And so it's almost as if they are new people. And if they're new people, you don't need an outside new person. The words of the Rebbe, 10c. On Shabbos, there is no need for a new face, for a Jew's face is incomparably more radiant on Shabbos than during the week. Our radiance renews on Shabbos and confers upon us the status of a new face. We're on an entirely new level. Now that we understand this concept, the rolling back of the tzimtzum, of the concealment, the greater divine revelation of our essential life force, we can now understand why we refrain from work on Shabbos. And work isn't what we consider work. Work is what the Torah considers work. But we still work. We pray, we We serve meals. Why is that? During the week, when godliness is concealed and we don't feel his presence, we're not only permitted to work, we're required to work, physical labor, because God put us on this world to improve the earth and to give our contribution, so to speak, to make the world a better place. But on Shabbos, when we stand before the divine, and we're literally standing before the divine because we now have an appreciation for a greater divine revelation, which is in our midst. Now is not the time to assert ourselves through work and through working the land, so to speak. Now's the time to bask in God's greatness through prayer and through Torah study. Text 11. These are the two poles, the two opposites that are expected of a Jew during the 6 days when the Torah mandates that we concern ourselves with our material body. Working is a mitzvah. Sunday through Friday, we got to go to work. Nevertheless, on Shabbos and Jewish holidays, when the soul is more radiant, we must transcend our body, its concerns, and its nature. It is self-understood that work is out of the question during these days. So yes, we need to work 6 days to fulfill the purpose on which we were placed on earth. But we can't forget our Creator. We can't forget the reason why we were put on this world. And so when we have Shabbos, God's presence is more palpable. God's presence is more manifest. And so we plug back into our divine consciousness. And that gives us strength for the next week to do our divine mission. And so Shabbos is a day of rest, but it's not a day necessarily of vacation. It's a day of rest of physical work, but it's a day of work, of spiritual work. It's time to tap into our spirituality. We tap into our spirituality. How do we tap into our spirituality? What do we do on Shabbos to tap into that greater level of divinity, of divine radiance? We spend time in prayer. We go to synagogue. We study some extra Torah. We meditate on spiritual ideas. We have Shabbos festive meals where we discuss Torah subjects, stories of our holy sages. We turn the entire day of Shabbos into a day befitting its reality of the rollback of the Tzimtzum. And so each one of us in our day, in our Shabbos, in our week, as we go through the week, and then when comes to Shabbos, let us think, how do I tap into my soul? What can I do to make my Shabbos more in sync with its reality of being a more palpable divine day? If I haven't been celebrating Friday night, maybe now's the time to think about, let's do a Friday night meal. We already do that. Someone can read a story, Hasidic story from the sages, and a weekly insight someone reads around the table. Turn our Shabbos into the day it ought to be, that holy day of rest, that holy day of divine rest from the concealment, where we are able to recognize our divine essence.